Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really wild set of claims from our source material surrounding a $15 copper pipe, highly specific ancient geometry, and the supposedly suppressed science of what practitioners call electric soil. If you've ever been curious about passive energy systems, backyard gardening, or historical scientific anomalies, you're absolutely in the right place. Let's just jump right in.
All right, let's start with this completely astonishing claim. Back in the 1970s, a Canadian farmer named Les Brown decided to build a full-size 16-foot wooden pyramid right on his farm. And according to the source, he didn't just see a tiny little bump in his harvest. No, he estimated his pyramid greenhouse produced roughly 36 times more food per square foot than a normal growing space. He even reported cucumbers growing several inches in a single night, and plants that were basically bulletproof against pests. It's a crazy anecdote, but it perfectly sets the stage for our deep dive today.
So the source material keeps hammering home this massive, unavoidable contrast. On one hand, you've got the global fertilizer industry, a $200 billion giant that completely relies on farmers buying their product year after year, right? And on the other hand, you have this proposition, a $15 permanent copper pipe installation that supposedly just sits there and harvests atmospheric energy. The argument here is that this total lack of a recurring revenue model is exactly why you'd never ever hear about this in a standard agricultural class.
Which brings us to Section 1, demystifying the math and geometry.
Okay, so think about phi, the golden ratio, 1.618. This isn't just some random number we made up. It's literally the single most recurring mathematical proportion in biology. It dictates the spiral of a nautilus shell, how sunflower seeds are arranged, even the double helix of human DNA. The source argues that when a pyramid is built to highly specific dimensions, it's actually aligning perfectly with the very mathematical language that biological life already uses to organize itself.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The specific angle they say you need is 51 degrees and 52 minutes. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the exact slope of the Great Pyramid of Giza. When you build a four-sided pyramid to this exact slope, the source claims the math does something pretty extraordinary. It simultaneously encodes both pi and phi out to 3 decimal places. Basically, no other 3D shape does this. So the creators of this method argue that this isn't just a fun piece of garden art, it's actually an antenna, specifically tuned to the mathematical fabric of reality itself.
Moving right along, let's look at Section 2, the suppressed science.
So, according to the creator, all this verified agricultural data was basically buried. Think about this. The British Electroculture Committee, which was actually staffed with real Nobel laureates, spent nearly 2 decades documenting massive yield gains using electrical methods. But then, in 1936, right as the synthetic fertilizer boom was really taking off, all those reports were suddenly stamped not for publication and locked away. Academic citations for electroculture just plummeted. As the source points out, you didn't even need a grand conspiracy. The market just naturally rewarded the consumable product over the permanent one.
But, the science just kept popping up in the weirdest places. Fast forward to 1959. A Czech radio engineer named Karel Durbal actually gets a patent for a cardboard pyramid. His claim that if you just rest a razor blade inside this cardboard shape, right at 1/3 of its height, it would maintain its sharpness. The chief patent examiner was super skeptical, tested it for 10 solid years, and actually found each blade lasted an average of 111 shaves compared to the usual 5. And Durbal wasn't claiming this was magic. He argued the geometry concentrated the Earth's natural magnetic fields to physically restore the blade's crystalline structure.
And these massive independent experiments, they've just kept happening all over the globe. I mentioned Les Brown earlier. Well, he actually blew himself 20 feet across his yard once when he grounded his pyramid with a conductive path. No joke. Then in the 90s, Alexander Galed built 50 of these massive 144-foot fiberglass pyramids all across Russia. He reported huge yield increases and even radar anomalies. More recently, in 2011, Belgian agronomist Yannick van Doorn showed that just putting seed potatoes under a copper pyramid for 2 days doubled their growth compared to control plants.
Now, to be totally fair and impartial here, critics do point out a lack of peer-reviewed Western journal confirmation for some of these wilder claims, but sticking to the hard data provided by the source, they actually point to a U.S. PubMed indexed study. Researchers tested a pyramid model built to those exact Egyptian proportions and found that the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide accelerated by 300% inside of it. Think about that for a second. That's a measurable, physical, chemical reaction changing its speed by 300% inside a geometric shape with absolutely no power source.
All right, let's get into the how-to with Section 3, building the copper antenna.
If you want to build this passive energy collector, you're going to need pure copper pipe. Why? Because copper is highly conductive and paramagnetically amplifies magnetic fields. The golden rule here is that your edge length has to equal the base length multiplied by 0.952. But listen, the absolute most vital step is the orientation. One flat side absolutely must face true north. You have to adjust for magnetic declination. The source warns that without this specific alignment to the Earth's magnetic field, the whole thing is just going to sit there completely inert.
There's also a massive warning from the creator here. Never, ever use iron or steel to connect your pipes. Iron actually decreases soil magnetism and can create drought-like conditions, which is exactly what we don't want. And definitely don't use painted or lacquered copper. The raw copper needs direct contact with the atmosphere. Over time, it's going to develop this green patina, copper carbonate, which protects the metal without ruining its conductivity.
Now for the really complex stuff. Section 4, the advanced underground battery.
The source describes this brilliant 4-layer synergy. It actually starts 2 feet underground with untreated hardwood logs. This acts as a microbial fuel cell, generating heat and releasing electrons as the wood breaks down. Above that is your wiring, a layer of biochar mixed with compost. Next is the electrolyte, which is just your regular topsoil where the roots live. And finally, the battery itself, a copper pipe and a zinc nail spaced out in the soil. The pyramid sits above all of this, feeding atmospheric charge straight down into this biologically active Earth battery.
Let's pause on that biochar layer for a second, because this is super critical. Biochar is basically just crushed hardwood charcoal, acting as the permanent wiring for the system. But the source makes a huge point here. Fresh biochar must be charged. You have to soak it in nutrient-rich liquids, like compost tea, for about 48 hours. Its internal surface area is astronomically huge, so if you just toss uncharged biochar into the ground, it acts like a giant sponge, sucking up nutrients and actually starving your plants instead of feeding them.
So, the million-dollar question, does this Earth battery actually produce real electricity? Well, according to the cited agronomists, absolutely. If you take a standard digital multimeter and press it to the copper pipe and the zinc nail right there in your soil, you should get a literal electrical reading, somewhere between 0.8 and 1.1 volts. That charged biochar increases the soil's electrical conductivity, carrying the pyramid's gathered charge deep down into the root zone.
The underlying chemistry here is just fascinating. The copper is acting as your cathode, physically drawing roots toward it through a biological response called electrotropism. The zinc nail, that's your anode. As the electrical current flows between the two, the zinc slowly corrodes, dropping zinc ions into the soil. Plants actually use that exact zinc to create tryptophan, which they need to make auxin, their master growth hormone. No zinc, no growth. This battery is literally dissolving its own anode to feed the plant's hormones.
Finally, let's talk proof in Section 5, measuring the results.
The source is super emphatic about this. To prove it works, you can't just eyeball it. You have to maintain a strict control row right next to your pyramid bed. Same soil, same watering, same seeds, just no metals and no geometry. They suggest using a Brix refractometer to measure the dissolved sugars in the leaves, since more sugar means higher nutrition and way less pest damage. By tracking the soil voltage, taking weekly photos beside a ruler, and actually weighing the final harvest on a scale, backyard guesses are transformed into undeniable, hard data.
We're going to wrap up this explainer by leaving you with this one final provocative thought from our source. You've got a $200 billion industry relying on you buying their stuff every single year. But this system, it relies on a $15 piece of copper and geometric math that literally encodes the constants of life itself. A system that actually gets stronger the longer it sits in the dirt. The physics never expires, the experiment is incredibly cheap, the risk is practically zero. So the only question left is, are you going to try building this in your own backyard or just keep scrolling? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.